All right, in this video, we're going to be continuing with sine and cosine functions. And rather than looking at a graph and identifying some properties, we're going to be given those properties and we have to write an equation for these. So our basic equation we're going to look at, called the parent function of either the sine or the cosine, looks like this. It's going to be y equals, or could be f of x equals, means the same thing. A cosine of bx plus c. Or it could be the same with sine, a sine bx plus c. Okay, whether it's y or f of x, and whether it's cosine or sine, it looks like this. There's really three pieces of information that are contained in this equation: the a, the b, and the c. So the a represents the amplitude. It's a good choice for that. The b, we're actually going to call that the frequency, but it has to do with the period. So it uses the period. And the c, it is the shift up or down, so we could call it the vertical shift. But it has to do with the midline, because ultimately the midline tells us is how much we're going to shift. All right, so the amplitude is going to be the easiest part. The amplitude, you basically just throw whatever the amplitude is in front. The frequency is going to be just a little bit more tricky. So this is probably the most important formula that we're going to use here. So b equals 2 pi over the period. So b, our frequency, we'll call it, is always going to be 2 pi divided by whatever the period is of our function. Okay, the vertical shift, the c, just equals the midline. If the midline is positive 5, then we're going to do plus 5. If the midline is negative 2, it's going to be minus 2. And then so a is just the amplitude. It's pretty easy. So really the only one you have to think a lot about is the b, which you're going to use the period. Again, it's called the frequency. We're going to do 2 pi divided by the period. All right, so let's take this information it gives us and see if we can write an equation. So this is supposed to be a cosine function. The amplitude is 4, so we're going to start by just typing in 4. It is a cosine, so I'm just going to type cos. The midline, we'll come back to that in a second. And the next thing I'm going to do is the period. So the period, it says, is 2 over 5. So what we want to do is find our b is going to be 2 pi, always on top, over the period, so over 2/5. Now here we have a fraction within a fraction, so when we have that, we're going to keep it, switch it, flip it. We're going to keep the top, 2 pi, times, multiply by the reciprocal, so times 5/2. We could also write that 2 pi over 1 if we want to. When we do that, it works out kind of nice because the 2's cancel, and we're actually just left with 5 pi over 1, or just 5 pi. So our b is actually just going to be 5 pi. We're going to type it in just like that. 5, then you can just type pi, gives you pi. And then make sure you type, I actually like to put it in parentheses, just to make sure I don't mess anything up there. So 5 pi, and we do need to throw an x in there as well. 5 pi x. And then our midline is 5, so this is going to be plus 5. So 4 cosine of 5 pi x plus 5. All right, let's go ahead and try another one. Let's clear the whole thing here. All right, this is a cosine function. The amplitude is 3, so I'm just going to go ahead and type that first. 3 cos, parenthesis, and then it's for the b. So I guess if you wanted to say a is 3, b is going to be 2 pi over the period. Period is 3 over 2. So 2 pi over 3 over 2 equals 2 pi multiplied by the reciprocal, so times 2 over 3. This becomes 2 pi times 2 is 4 pi. 1 times 3 is 3. So that's 4 pi over 3. We always want to reduce it if we can. This is the best we can do here. So that will be 4 pi over 3x. And then our midline, our c, equals 2. Because that's our vertical shift. 2. So we're going to put a plus 2 out there. All right, so hopefully you're starting to get the hang of it here. Do one more. So again, we got this one just a little mixed up. It's cosine. Amplitude is 3. So A equals 3. B is going to be 2 pi over the period. So this one's a little bit trickier. 2 pi over 7 pi over 4. All right, so on this one, when we keep the top, multiply by the reciprocal, it's times 4 over 7 pi. What's going to happen is, since we have a pi on the top and the bottom, those pi's are actually going to wipe out. Okay, this is over 1, so we get 2 times 4 is 8 over 7. So it's going to be 8/7 for B. And the midline is 2, so C equals 2. Let's go and type that. So 3 cosine, parenthesis, our B was 8 over 7, so I'm just going to type 8 over 7. For some reason it's not. There we go. X, and then plus 2. I don't know if they have any midlines where they're negative. If there was a negative midline, then you would just put minus, but it looks like they're all positive for whatever reason. All right, let's go ahead and look at the next section. So on this one, we're going to be given a graph, and then we're going to have to write the equation based off of whatever this graph is. So we're essentially going to solve it the same way, except instead of giving us the information, the amplitude is 3, period is 2 pi over 3 or whatever, and also whatever the midline is, we're going to have to figure those out first. So we can do that because we've done that in the past few videos. We need amplitude, we need a period, and we need a midline. And then we'll have the same information we had in the previous one. So first thing that when you're doing these, I think the easiest thing to do is find the midline. So find the middle. I believe it's going to be right here. Let's see. Yep. Middle of this function is going to be there at -2 because then we're up 1, 2, 3. Right, so it's 3 up there, and also 1, 2, 3 down to the bottom. So 3 in either direction. So our midline there is going to be at x equals -2. So -2 is the midline. We also already found our amplitude because it's 3 to the top and 3 to the bottom. So amplitude is 3. Remember, that's the distance from the midline to the top or the bottom. And then for the period, pick a spot. I always try to pick just the beginning at 0. It's generally the easiest thing. And then when do we complete one full revolution here? One full cycle, if you will. And that's at 2 pi. So you can see it's 2 pi and then it starts over again. So our period is then 2 pi. And now we can begin to write our equation. So A is just going to be the same amplitude, it's just 3. B is going to be 2 pi over the period. So 2 pi over the period, which is 2 pi. So 2 pi over 2 pi is actually just 1. And then our C is the midline. This one does happen to be -2, so C is going to be -2. So now we've got all of our information. Oh, the other thing that we have to figure out on this is whether it's a cosine or a sine. This one is a cosine. How we know that is by looking at where it starts. So on this y-axis, remember sines would start here in the middle if it was a sine, because it would start at 0. So it always starts at the midline. Cosine starts at the top top or the bottom, depending on if it's been reflected. So cosine starts at top or bottom. That's how we can know. And sine starts at middle. That's how we can figure it out if you're not sure. So this is a cosine graph. And I believe we can just write it as y equals. So y equals 3. This is a cosine, parenthesis. Our b was just 1, so it would be like 1x, but we don't really need the 1 there, so we're just going to write x. Close my parentheses. And then minus 2, because my midline was at negative 2. And there we go. All right, let's go ahead and try another one. This one, I guess maybe the first thing to figure out would be is if it's sine or cosine. Look at where it's starting up there at 2. So it's not starting in the middle, so we know that this is a cosine. All right, from there, let's find the midline. Midline looks like it's right in the middle there, because then we're going up to 2, and we're going down to 2, down to there to negative 2. So we've got our amplitude, which is 2. Our midline is actually at 0. It actually isn't shifted. And then our period is going to be, well, let's see, a cycle here. Start here, go down, back up to the top. So it looks like our period is pi over 2. So now we can find our A, B, and C. We already got our A and our C. So our B is going to be 2 pi over the period. So 2 pi over 2. We're going to keep the top, multiply by the bottom flipped. So flip the bottom becomes 2 over pi. We then can cancel out. We can cancel the pi's. And then 2 times 2 is 4. 4 over 1, which is just 4. So our B is 4 in this case. So we've got y equals 2 for the amplitude, cosine of 4, and then we always need our x. This one, since the midline was 0, it would be like, if you can envision like an imaginary plus 0, but we don't write plus 0 because that's the same as just not writing anything. So we're just going to write it as 2 cosine of 4x. All right, let's do one more. This one should be a good one. Okay, so right off the bat on this one, you might have noticed this one is a sine function. Okay, because it's starting here in the middle. So it goes up and down and back to this point, right? This is a sine function. Our amplitude, let's see if we can identify the midline and that we can find our amplitude. All right, it looks like the midline to me starts right there at 1, where it crosses the x-axis or the y-axis. All right, and then the amplitude, we go up from 1 up to 5 is 4, and 1 down to negative 3 is also 4. So our amplitude is going to be 4. Our midline, as we saw, was shifted up by 1, so C is going to be 1. Our period, we start here, our one cycle ends at 8 pi. So 8 pi is the period. So not 84. 8 pi. So our B then is going to be 2 pi over the period. So 2 pi over 8 pi. This one we just need to reduce. The pi's cancel. 2 over 8 is 1/4. So our equation, y equals sine, and actually I forgot amplitude, 4 sine, amplitude is 4, parenthesis, our B is 1/4 x, and plus 1, so we're shifted up 1, midline's at 1. All right, our last activity is going to be some just multiple choice. It's going to give you a graph, and then you have to identify what is the correct equation. All right, so let's do just a couple examples of this. Basically, we're going to identify the features, and then based on those features, which is the correct equation. So in this one, it looks like the midline is up there at 120, right? So we know actually that narrows it down to one of these two. Amplitude is the same in both. It's 20 in both. Actually, the B in here is the same in both. So the only thing that's different, if you'll notice, is cosine versus sine. So that's how we're going to identify this one. Now you look at the midline. If it starts at the midline, that means it's sine. If it starts at the top or the bottom, that means it's cosine. So this one does start at the top up here. Starts above the midline. So that means it's got to be the cosine function. So just use the process of elimination. You don't necessarily have to identify every single feature. Just find the one that makes it distinct from the others. Let's go and try another one. Clear the board. All right, this one, we're down here at negative 300 for the midline. So we know it's going to be minus 300. They've all got that, so it doesn't help too much. Now notice another thing about this one. If we're trying to identify if it's sine or cosine, first of all, it does not start at the midline, which tells you that it is not sine. It tells you it's cosine. But it didn't start at the top. It actually started at the bottom. Okay, and remember how I said it could start at the top or the bottom? If it starts at the bottom, that tells us it's been reflected, because it's a reflection of it from the top, which tells us we need a negative sign in there. So we know this is a cosine and it has a negative because it's a reflection. So the only one with a negative and a cosine is going to be that one right there. All right, last one for good measure. All right, this one can tell that it's a sine function. They're all sine, so it's kind of a dead giveaway. There's our midline at 400. It's all plus 400, so it doesn't help us at all. There is two that are negatives, you can see. This one is not a negative in front because cosine does start by going up first and then goes down. So it's going to be one of the positive ones. The defining feature on this one that's different about these is the B in there. So the 2 pi over the period. So you should probably figure out what the period is. The period here from start to finish is 160. So we need to find the B. The B is 2 pi over the period, 160. And that reduces to pi over 80. So that means we're looking at the second one here. Okay. So hopefully from all of that, you've got a good understanding of how to write these equations. If you are struggling, make sure you are reaching out to me. All right, good luck.